CMC center, the closest MCC center. And it's processed there, and then, I don't know where it goes from there. I think they process it in big segments. But they process, go through all the kids there with the central in the I think that's an interesting to see.
Looks like it's time to start our meeting, so thank you all for coming. Welcome to the fall meeting of the Iowa Mennonite Historical Society. Typically we do a little business at this meeting. We don't have much business for tonight. Those of you who are members, you can renew your membership out at the table out there. Jane will be glad to facilitate that for you. We do have apple butter for sale for anybody who would wish to have some, so you're welcome to that. I think that's really all the business we got to do, and so we'll move on to our program, and I want to open with prayer at this point. Thank you, Lord, for this day and the opportunity to gather together to contemplate the actions of our ancestors and to learn for today and for tomorrow. Thank you for their witness and their stands that they made, and just pray that you would guide us to be faithful today in our circumstances that we find ourselves in. Amen. So our subject for discussion tonight is that of World War I conscience objection. As was advertised, there's a display over here in the hallway in the small room about conscientious objectors in World War I from around the country. And it's an interesting display, so take advantage of looking at that tonight or whenever. I thought this would be a good opportunity to review the history of what happened during World War I in this community. And so that's our goal for our program tonight. Conscience objection has been a long-standing principle in the Anabaptist movement and the Mennonite Church, the Brethren, the Quakers, and others. And it got tested in a very new and different way during World War I. So I've asked Frank Yoder to review that history for us. And Frank, you want to come at this time?
War always has a way of creating a lot of tension in society. You have people who are leaving, young men and now young women, who are leaving to go off to war, and inevitably some of them will die, which creates, of course, a lot of tension for conscientious objectors. They appear in the eyes of many as cowards, people unwilling to do their duty, people who enjoy the benefits of freedom that others say the wars bring, even though not every war is fought for freedoms. But wars are fought for a lot of different reasons. And even to a pacifist, not every war is the same. And when we look at the wars in the United States, especially World War I and World War II, they're quite different wars. When it comes to World War I, most historians argue that that was fought for really unjustifiable reasons. The war started in Europe. It was fought with Germany and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire on one side, with Great Britain, France, and Russia on the other side. The United States was initially neutral. The feeling was, that's their war, it's not our war, we don't want anything to do with it. There was a fairly strong isolationist movement at that time, people who said we don't need to be involved in that. Woodrow Wilson was the president, and in 1916, he ran on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But by 1917, in April of 1917, the United States enters the war for a variety of reasons that we don't need to get into here. But looking back at the origins of the war, it started in 1914. And when you look at the reasons why these nations went to war, they don't make a lot of sense to us today. There were alliances that have been created that committed these countries, these various countries, that if one of them is attacked, the other countries would come to their aid. So Great Britain, France, and Russia were all tied together. Germany and Serbia, or Germany, Austria, Hungary were tied together. There was a lot of posturing leading up to the war. Countries basically playing chicken with each other, daring each other to go to war. And you had diplomatic failures when things could have been negotiated, they weren't. You had some leaders who I think were probably mentally not completely stable, which never helps. And when things got tense, all it took was the assassination of an archduke in Serbia to start this war. So an event that seemed in many ways to have nothing to do with the world itself, other than this little place, suddenly pulls everybody together because these nations have these alliances that bring them in when one of them is attacked. Another factor in all of this was that the people involved, the military people, did not understand what this war was going to be like. Europe had been basically peaceful to a large extent for about 100 years, since Napoleon in the early 1800s. There had been wars, but most of them were short. They were fought away from population centers by professional armies. Not a lot of destruction, not a lot of killing. But by 1914, when this war starts, things had changed pretty dramatically in ways that nobody quite understood. There had been changes in the technology, particularly the invention or the development of artillery that was very destructive. Shells could be fired up to 100 miles. There was also the creation of machine guns. And those were responsible for millions of deaths during this war. But going into the war, people didn't understand that, or they overlooked it. There was a sense that we would not fight in a way that was so cruel, that was simply not humane in our sense of what a war would be. So when the war starts, it starts in France, and Germany invades France, and it very quickly devolves into trench warfare, where you have armies lined up in trenches that ran all the way from Switzerland to the North Sea, across northern France. And the trenches in many cases were close enough that they could hear the other side. And the way the war was fought was soldiers, they would organize an assault. So at a certain moment, the soldiers would leave the trench, cross what they called no man's land, try to get to the other side, and basically take over that trench. And that's where the machine guns became so destructive, because one man with a machine gun could stop hundreds of soldiers advancing in the open. So by the time the U.S. enters a war in 1917, millions of people have died, and these trenches have moved very, very little. There's always this idea of the generals that if we can get a breakthrough, we'll be through the trench, we'll be back in the back of behind the trenches, we'll advance, and the war will be over. It never happened. In one battle, just as an example, in the Battle of the Somme, 60,000 people died on one afternoon. So the destruction was pretty incredible. And what was also interesting was leading up to the time when the United States entered the war. As I said, there was a strong isolationist movement, people who wanted nothing to do with it. But when the U.S. declares war, that movement really disappears very quickly. And the level of patriotism, it's almost fanatical. It's difficult to understand exactly what drove this. But people got behind the war effort in ways that you really haven't ever seen since. And so in communities, this played out in ways that really put a spotlight on conscientious objectors and on Mennonites or other groups that were pacifists. For example, it wasn't just for the young men who were drafted, but also in the communities, people were expected to buy war bonds. And this becomes a very test of your patriotism. Did you buy a war bond? And the newspapers would run lists of people and how much they had paid for a war bond. In some communities, bankers were on the committees to sell bonds. They would use bank records to target people and tell them, okay, you should be buying this many bonds because we know how much money you have. So a lot of what was going on was basically illegal, but that's the way it was. So for Mennonites, did you buy a war bond or did you fly a flag? Those were two of the kind of litmus tests that were going on. And in the press, in the newspapers, conscientious objectors and pacifists were often vilified. And I've got a couple quotes here I'll read. The first one is from the Washington Journal, so a local newspaper. This was in June of 1918. So the U.S. had been in the war now about for a year. And this is what they had to say. The so-called conscientious objector has caused the government much trouble. There are more than 100 of these conscientious objectors at Camp Dodge, which was in Des Moines. In many cases, they refuse to work. In all cases, they refuse to drill or receive military training. They become common loafers. The government feeds them. The effect on other members of the camp is bad. It represents insubordination. The majority of conscientious objectors at Camp Dodge are from Hendry and Washington counties, and they represent 2 Mennonite churches. I don't think their data is quite right. I think it would have been more than 2. But these young men have been stirred up by periodical visits of a leading Mennonite editor. And again, I don't know who that was referring to. It is predicted that if the men go back into the places from which they came, there will be all sorts of trouble. Discharging 100 conscientious objectors would require 100 more of your men to be drafted who did not make such a claim. Hence, the people of the cities of Washington and Henry counties have been much concerned in regard to what might happen in case these young men were sent home. And a second short article or short piece, this was from the Winfield Beacon, October 17th, 1918, so only a few weeks before the end of the war. The fact appears to be coming to the surface that he, conscientious objector, is a coward of the yellow streak brand and puts up this plea as a hole to crawl through. Every man should have an opinion of his own on all subjects, but when his home, his native land, are threatened by a band of baby-killing devils in human form, it is time to smother conscientious scruples and say, don't come this way or we will blow you to kingdom come and then some. The conscientious objector should sneak back in some corner and meditate on what little he amounts to among those who by word, act, and deed have brought peace and harmony to a tortured world. The reference to baby-killing devils was Germans were often vilified in the press, and there were stories of German soldiers throwing babies in the air and catching them on bayonets. Stories which have never been proven and almost certainly were not true. But that was the kind of propaganda that was out there. Locally, people were targeted. My grandfather, Dan Fisher, was an East Union minister at the time, and he regularly visited Camp Dodge, where conscientious objectors were kept. There was a Sergeant Sparks who was very nasty, and on one occasion told Dan to leave and he did not need to come back. At home, Dan Fisher was targeted. One evening, a line of cars drove into their yard. Men got out and were looking for him, and he happened not to be home that evening. They searched all the buildings, intending to tar and feather him. His wife, Ida, who was at home, was very shaken by this, and she knew many of the men who were there, and later said they thought these people were their friends. But attitudes at the local level changed just as they did at the national level. Now, just as a bit of contrast, I want to touch for just a second on World War II. World War II comes 20 years after World War I. It's the war that gets the most attention. If you go into a bookstore or a library, you will see shelf after shelf of book on World War II, but only a short section on World War I. So World War II is the one most people are familiar with. But it's interesting and kind of ironic because in World War II, COs again were targets, but the attitudes were fundamentally different. In June of '42, this was 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Cologne and Wellman saw incidents of vandalism and harassment. Dan Fisher, again, now Bishop at East Union, was one of those targeted, and he was accused of coercing young men to register as conscientious objectors. There were bombs set off in Kelowna. There were 3 men hung in effigy on Main Street, and other kinds of vandalism going on. Churches scattered, or yellow paint scattered on the churches. But all of this was widely reported in newspapers, including the newspapers from Muscatine, from Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, and even Des Moines. So this was public knowledge. The young men who were responsible for this were arrested and charged. But the public response outside of the local community was quite different. And there was an editorial in the Des Moines Register, and I'll read that excerpt from that. It said, prompt action by the sheriff and county attorney should end the unfortunate revival of yellow paint and nuisance bombs directed at our good Mennonite fellow citizens there. The Mennonites came by their pacifism honorably. Prompt action by the sheriff and county attorney should end the unfortunate revival. Oh, I'm sorry, I got in the wrong place. Bishop Dan Fisher is reported as saying, whether a Mennonite fights with the armed forces is entirely a personal matter up to the individual. And then back to the article, it is certainly not a matter of rowdy neighbors with yellow paint and nuisance bombs. So the attitude in World War II was much more supportive of Mennonites, which is ironic because most historians would say World War II was a war that should be fought, that it was more justified than World War I. But there were many changes in that interval, which meant Mennonites now had Mennonites, pacifists, other pacifists, Quakers, even the Amish, Church of the Brethren. They had worked with the government to negotiate ways in which COs could serve. So they set up the camps and that sort of thing. So things were much more organized than they were in World War I. In World War I, there was a law that gave conscientious objectors the right to be conscientious objectors, but that law was not often passed down to the level of the camps. So the people in the camps either ignored it or didn't know about it. So now I think we'll hear from some of the stories of people who in World War I.
Thank you, Frank. So, he didn't mention it, but the Sedition Act that was passed was very anti-German. You weren't supposed to speak German in public, and German communities, not only the Mennonites, but other German communities were harassed and given a hard time because of the animosity against Germans that was stirred up by all this. In the Revolutionary War and Civil War, people could buy their replacements. When World War I came, there wasn't any provision for that. There was supposedly this recognition that you had the right to be a CO if you belonged to an established religion that proposed that. But they didn't specify what you could do, and so these military camps, the COs were drafted. They had to appear in the camp, and what did they do? Well, the treatment was quite varied. So we'll hear some stories about that. Happy Henry H. Miller was a member of East Union. Us older people know him very well. He had quite an experience, and so his grandson Tom will talk about that.
As Al introduced me, I'm his grandson of Henry. Full disclaimer, I am not a historian, nor am I the subject matter expert on this. My sister Ann is. She is not here, so you're stuck with me. And my really only qualification is I am his grandson, but maybe that's enough. Grandpa passed away when I was 11.
Wait, show me a picture again.
So this is a picture my sister Ann sent of Grandpa while he was a cook or some part when he was cooking. I don't know if it was exactly at Fort Leavenworth or where his experiences was. What shocked me, just to go off this, is how much my dad looks like him. I had never realized that. Grandpa was 77 when I was born. Died when he was 88, I was 11, so I'm not sure this is a good pacifist picture. He is wielding 2 huge knives. So, but yeah, I had never seen that picture and was happy to see it and fun to see how much Dad resembles him. So yeah, I have only a few memories of him, so I want to understand his story better, what he was experiencing, to better understand where I come from. The source of most of my information is from my sister, and I'm also referencing information from L. Dave Yoder's book, East Union Members Serving in Times of War and in Times of Peace, 1917 to 1996. Now a little background information. Grandpa Henry was born on April 10th, 1892 in Holmes County, Ohio, to Henry B. Miller and Sarah Miller. When Henry was 4 years old, his mother died, leaving 7 children. His father remarried and had 9 more children. Henry was raised in the Amish faith. When Henry was 21, he set out for Iowa, ending up in the Cologne area. I don't know if I should share this, but part of the reason Grandpa left Ohio was because he was tempted by alcohol. There was a neighbor boy who seemed to have a supply of it, and Grandpa wanted to get away from that temptation. Smart move. Grandpa stayed with the Malin Slavo family and worked as a carpenter in the area, building houses and barns with a work crew. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. At that time, the U.S. Army had approximately 1,000 men in active service. A month later, on May 18, 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, requiring all men ages 21 to 30 to register for potential military service, the first large-scale national conscription. Pacifists would only be exempt from combat, not from so-called non-combat duty as defined by the president. The first day of the draft was June 5th, 1917. Grandpa registered as required by law, along with 10 million American men. Grandpa reported to the draft board in Iowa City and presented himself as a bleeder, a hemophiliac. So that is a genetic blood clotting disorder that causes him to bleed longer after a cut or a trauma. They sent him to the hospital for tests. Some doctors said he should go home. Others said he might as well take a bit of his medicine as the rest. Kind of a strange comment from a doctor, in my opinion. The bit of medicine was a little bit more severe for Grandpa than others. Clearly a gunshot wound, or even Grandpa cutting his finger while slicing potatoes, would put him in serious danger. Combat was almost certainly a death sentence. I wonder if Grandpa was a little shocked that the government still wanted him to serve. Henry was a member of the Amish church at that time. However, he received little help or guidance from the Amish. So he reached out to the Mennonites who had gone to the government and worked out details for non-combatants. Henry was drafted and required to report to Camp Dodge, Iowa, on September 17th, 1917. His stepmother back in Ohio offered to hide him on the farm, but he declined the offer, deciding to take his medicine. At Camp Dodge, he drilled for 5 days, but he declined the 5 days. On the 5th day, the captain gave a little talk to the men. He told them, "Now, if any of you men have any religion about you, you might just as well shout it. That's somewhere and get the devil into yourselves, and you're going over there and kill all those Germans." Grandpa just couldn't get in line with that. He said in an interview in 1979, "Well, my religion just couldn't be shelved. You know, I wouldn't know where to find it when I came back." The next morning, he presented a letter that Sanford Yoder had given him, explaining the Mennonite pacifist belief called non-resistance affirmed. The captain didn't know what to do with it, so he sent him to the kitchen to cook for the COs. By all accounts, Grandpa was a good cook. In October of 1917, Henry and his company was transferred to Camp Cody in Deming, New Mexico. Here the military drill continued and now included uniforms and rifles. Grandpa again presented himself as a non-resistant affirmed. He was ordered to the kitchen to again cook for the other COs in the camp. In reading the interview in court-martial proceedings, Grandpa obviously had a strong resistance to carrying a rifle, but additionally, he also seemed strongly to object to wearing the uniform. It kind of makes sense to me that Grandpa, being Amish, would object to wearing the uniform, or probably any clothes, not specifically Amish. Although I don't honestly know in 1917 what was different about Mennonite clothes and everyone else living in rural America at the time. After several months in Camp Cody, Henry and several other COs were transferred to the remount station to take care of Army horses. Henry and other COs determined that this was doing Army work and refused work at the remount station. They were confined to the stockade to await court-martial. Now, why did Grandpa and the other COs decide that taking care of horses was doing Army work? Was it cooking for COs and officers also doing Army work? I think it was the constant fear of being transferred to different locations, doing different army responsibilities, that contributed to Grandpa and other COs saying, enough is enough. Currently, they weren't carrying rifles, but a different setting, serving under different officers, what that might not recognize their non-resistance of firm stance, or even more severe punishments for questioning orders, led to this being a tipping point. The more I read through Grandpa's story, I could tell Grandpa was a hard worker. They liked work and helping others, but honestly, he and his fellow COs were horrible soldiers. They more than once questioned orders, refused to drill when they were supposed to, and openly defied an officer by defending a fellow soldier who they felt was being treated unfairly. Grandpa was almost struck by a corporal for defending his fellow compatriot, but the corporal lowered his hand and just told him to shut his damn mouth. The best example of their insubordination was when they were asked to thrash wheat and oats on a Sunday. The CEO said, "Now what in the world is wrong with you people that you, after you work 6 days of this week, now the 7th day we have to work? This is the Sabbath day. Why not wait till tomorrow?" Not surprisingly, the soldiers were angry and got a couple of boxes full of handcuffs. The intent was to handcuff the men together, take them out to the field and make them work. While the soldiers tried to put the handcuffs on, not one of the handcuffs worked. None of the keys would work to unlock the handcuffs. The soldiers gave up and sent the boys back to their barracks. Grandpa didn't know if the boys' constant talking, making noise, distracting the soldiers contributed to the keys not working, but he described it as a miracle. The COs must have felt that God delivered them from working that day, showing them he was in charge, and of course to obey the Sabbath. I wonder if those particular soldiers ever tried to make them work on a Sunday again. I imagine that Grandpa and the other COs were respected, and at the same time infuriated the officers and soldiers that dealt with them. They were respected for standing for what they believed and doing their non-combatant work, but also very frustrated for questioning and not going along with the flow. Grandpa was court-martialed on June 24th, 1918. In reading the transcripts from the court-martial proceedings, a few things stuck out to me. This is not surprising, but the questions asked, how they were asked, the certain patterns that they were asked, were definitely designed to get Grandpa to trip up or contradict his peace stance. Actually, just reading it kind of gave me a headache. Because of his Amish background and heritage, the inquisitors tried to paint Grandpa as perhaps a German sympathizer, since the Amish immigrated from Germany, even speaking a dialect of German at home, Pennsylvania German, Grandpa called it. Questions like, do you have a German newspaper at your home to read? Are the Germans good people? Do you have relatives in Germany? And then the questions got worse. Would you protect your sister from outrage, as they called it, at the hands of a German beast? Grandpa responded he would do all he could to help, but not kill. Often these questions were along the lines of why you can't kill or go to war, but others can. His response was simple: I cannot judge. Judge for yourself. Grandpa was found guilty of violating the 64th Article of War, willfully disobeying a superior officer, and was sentenced to be dishonorably discharged from service and confined at hard labor for 15 years at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. I imagine the thought of serving 15 years must have weighed very heavily on him. His name was replaced by a number. Henry was assigned to farming labor at Fort Leavenworth, milking cows. He walked a quarter of a mile to milk 3 times a day. At first he was escorted by an armed guard, but later he got a star above his number, which meant he could be trusted to go out and milk without being guarded. Grandpa was released from Fort Leavenworth along with 112 other conscientious objectors in January 1919, after 9 months, about 2 months after the war ended in November of 1918. He described himself as feeling like a little calf that had been tied up too long and didn't know if he wanted to go or not. Am I free? Really? Am I free? Can I go where I want? Grandpa went back to Kelowna. The Army reevaluated his court-martials and determined the Board of Inquiry now finds these men sincere and who in their judgment would have been recommended for furloughs if they had had the opportunity of being examined by the Board of Inquiry before the court-martial proceedings. Basically, he was medically discharged and received payment for his work cooking during his service. Grandpa actually sent the money back to the government. In total, 504 conscientious objectors were court-martialed. 503 were found guilty with one acquittal. With many COs in the military camps and disciplinary barracks suffered physical abuse and torture from the soldiers, my grandfather never did. In his 1979 interview, he said he was treated well, got pushed around a bit, but never hit or hurt. He did tell of other COs facing physical abuse during their service in World War I. Grandpa was harassed when he did return home, not physical harassment, just people questioning what he did during the war. I imagine most in the Mennonite and Amish communities felt some harassment from others, resenting their peace stance. For those that lost their sons into war or suffered the traumas of war, I could understand the feeling of resentment. Grandpa could have taken an easier road. He could have not reported and hid. Actually, I think getting married back then was another reason to not have to serve. But he chose a path that was a way of responsible citizenship to his country, but also more importantly, didn't compromise his beliefs in what God and Jesus called him to do. Grandpa's CO World War I experience had a profound effect on his life. When asked, how did you feel when you were drafted? His reply was, well, I got on my knees and I called on God for help, and I got it. I got help so I could stand it. His burdens were not taken away, but God helped him through the turbulent and difficult times. Grandpa's words describing his World War I experience. I had a good experience, but I wouldn't give anything for another dose of it. I wouldn't want it, but it done me a lot of good. He thought it made him a better person, that it taught him to get along with other people. When he returned, he left the Amish church and joined the Mennonite church. What appealed to Grandpa was how the Mennonites did missionary work with the CEOs, visiting them and doing good works for them. Leaving the Amish church, Grandpa risked being shunned. His father questioned him on leaving the Amish church. Grandpa's reply, well, Dad, you were my boss for some time, until I got on age, and now I got God to obey, another father. Grandpa was not shunned by his family, and he still felt love and support from his family. Henry married Mary Pearl Gamrich. They had 4 boys, Daniel, Monroe, Quentin, and my dad, Paul. He farmed for a living. He was ordained as a deacon at East Union Mennonite Church in 1933 and served as a deacon for 48 years. Members of East Union that remember him said he sat near the front of the church during services, often giving affirming amens to the message, and gave short testimonies that when he felt led. He went to be with the Lord in 1981. Grandpa's middle initial was H. I'm pretty sure it was for happy. Most people refer to him as Happy Henry. My memories of him are of him whistling when he rode with us to church. He seemed to be able to make the sounds of 2 birds at once. I don't remember him ever not smiling. He had sincere joy that came from within. Memories of extended gatherings at Christmas were filled with talk, some hymns and songs, and much, much laughter. In listening to the audio of his interviews, it was Grandpa's laugh that made me smile. If you knew Grandpa, or you know my dad, my siblings, my uncles, aunts, and cousins, you know the Miller's propensity for laughter. What a gift. We are all blessed to have a little Happy Henry in us.
These young men went to camp. They were lined up and asked to step forward and put on a uniform, and their response was variable. Some men from Mennonite churches did put on the uniform and agree to do non-combatant work. Others drew the line at other places, and so, the treatment in different camps was different, and treatment from different officers in the camp was different. So the superior officer may have had a benevolent attitude, but junior officers and corporals and so on would be ones to give them kind of a hard time. Two other men that were well known in this community, Jesse Hartzler and George Miller, have stories of some rather difficult treatment. So I've asked Marcus Miller to share about that. So come on forward, Marcus. At the end of the meeting, we will take up an offering. This display from Newton has a cost associated with bringing it here, so ask you to share in that. And if there's more than needed for that, will be for our museum to tell these stories. Marcus?
Okay. First, Happy Henry was my grandpa's oldest brother, I believe. So I grew up hearing stories about him and his experience. My dad has a tape of when he interviewed my grandpa and Henry, and you can't hear much of what they're saying because they're laughing too much at the time. Niall asked if I'd say something about Jesse Hartzler and George Miller. Most of the information I have is from this book, a source book that was put together, oral history interviews of World War I, Conscientious Objectors. Jesse Hartzler was born in Missouri, and George Miller was born in Walnut Creek. It made me wonder if there's something about stubborn people coming from Holmes County, Walnut Creek, and their experiences. As far as I know, I'm not related to George Miller. Anyway. So Jesse Hartzler was born in Missouri, raised there. He was drafted during World War I and sent first to Texas to a camp there, and then was court-martialed and sent to Fort Leavenworth. Before ending up at there, these men seemed to experience some of the worst times before they got to Fort Leavenworth. It was at the camps, and it doesn't seem, in reading through these interviews and others, they didn't always have a lot of guidance from their church and their pastors as to where to draw the line, what's an appropriate place to draw the line. Is it okay to drill? Is it okay to do some milk cows? Is it okay to march? And they didn't always get very good answers on that. And Hartzler reports that when he made his position known, let's see, where did I have that at? Again, the officers were somewhat sympathetic, but both Hartzler and Miller talk about being sent to the guardhouse. And here they were with soldiers that were often in the guardhouse for other reasons. They'd gotten in trouble. And it seems like almost a punishment for the conscientious objectors. So Hartzler writes, or says, "We were sent to the guardhouse when we refused to accept work. We were not mistreated by the officers, but when we got to the guardhouse, they had what they called a kangaroo court, and it was a common procedure. Because we were conscientious objectors, this became much more severe. There were 4 of us at this time, COs. We were beaten with straps, many stripes. This continued for a number of days, I should say about 4 days, and on the last day it was still worse. He talked about getting hit about 24 times. And then the officers show up and ask what happens, and he takes his shirt off and shows them his bloody back. Hartzler then ends up after the war. He's court-martialed, sent to Fort Leavenworth, and then in 1939 moves to Bellman, where he works for Maple Crest. George Miller, born in Walnut Creek, moves to Milford, Nebraska with his family, is raised there, And he probably suffered as much as anybody that you read about in this collection of interviews. He had been married, but his wife died along with 2 of his children, and so he was drafted, was not married. So he was a little older, he was 31 when he was drafted. And he thought that might have been part of the reason why he faced a little more difficulty. So again, sent to camp and then mistreated. And I'm just going to read some of this again. So one evening, he is, soldiers break his nose. He's hit and he breaks his nose. And then the next day, we were about to be transferred to the disciplinary barracks the next day. And of course, these soldiers knew this, and before that time, I had my nose broke. I was knocked down because I would not obey this one commander. My head and eyes were black and blue. Then they came in that night. The soldiers came in that night. They decided among themselves that they were going to see what they could do with me. They got us out of our bunks in the evening and took us under the shower, and they had these brushes, and they scrubbed you a while, and they wanted to see if you wouldn't promise to wear the uniform. When I got back this one time, I had to report it because I was sick, on top of being black and blue in my face. And I heard them when I was in line going to the infirmary. I heard them say, "Here comes the CO." And when I got out of the line, I couldn't breathe because my nose was smashed in. And they wanted to give me 2 little white capsules for my ailment, for breaking my nose, and for when I was sick. The minute they appeared to me, I said, "Don't take them because you're going to die before long if you do." And I had a doctor friend tell me when I got home from camp, I asked him and he said, "Well, if you would have taken those, you would have never seen daylight the next day." So that makes me wonder what they were, but anyway. So that was, he says, that was, the worst of it was, they took you out that evening, and again, this happens to him again. They took him out, took his clothes off my back, and put me down head first in a tub of water, and first tried to scrub me. They took these hard brushes, and then took these brooms that were half worn out and got over my body, and I was just like pins all over my body. Sanford Yoder can tell you all of that. He came there the next day and saw me after I was over in another building. And they took me and stuck me in a tub of water, and every once in a while they would let me out and ask me, and I would say, "No, I still can't do it. I can't do it." And finally, I guess they saw that they can't do anything with me, and finally they let me go. I heard one officer talk to another officer. He said, "We got our orders not to draw blood on him," but they did, and my body was just bleeding. I thought that this was the last time that I would go down into the water. And then they took me in and they threw me on the bed. They took my bedding all the way, nothing but bare springs on my bunk. It was a cold, chilly September night after I was sick a whole week on this other deal. And they put me on the bed there, and I didn't have my clothes, no bedding. They had taken my clothes, my suitcases, and everything. There I was, shaking like a leaf. And then he talks about an officer coming, trying to provide some help, and the officer finally gives him some towels and his clothes. So when he gets to Fort Leavenworth, he says, "I'm actually treated fairly well there," because he was with other COs, and there seemed to be a little more regulation. He notes that he had big yellow spots on his body from all the scrubbing that night, so I'm guessing he was bruised really badly in that incident. So he suffered some of the worst accounts in that. After the war, he's court-martialed, sent to Fort Leavenworth, and is released, returns to Milford, and then he also moves to Wellman in 1939. So the end of the Depression, Wellman, my understanding is one of the areas that did have plenty of work, mostly because of Maple Crest. George Miller worked as a carpenter. He had been ordained as a minister at East Fairview in Milford. At Wellman Mennonite, he's one of the pastoral leaders, and also is the guy who takes charge of building the building that still stands there. So some of you may know him. I don't know that I ever met him, but Marvin raised his hand. Yeah. So pretty incredible story, and of staying true to his convictions.
Thank you, Marcus. Sources of information for these kinds of stories. this source book that Marcus mentioned, Bethel College got a grant, and they interviewed all the World War I conscience objectors they could find, recorded these interviews. Tom's sister tells me that the audio recording of Happy Henry's interview is available from Bethel College. So anybody that was interviewed there, apparently their audio may be available if you search it out. But this is just a little sample of stories that Bethel has collected. In the conference history book, Same Spirit, Holly Blosser Yoder, there's a chapter there about the conscience objectors in Iowa, and Holly will talk here shortly. Numbers are incomplete, but there were 14 people at Sugar Creek that were drafted and reported to camps. West Union had 12, East Union 7, Lower Deer Creek 4. And other churches, of course, had some. Reading Jesse Hartzler's interview, one of the things that struck me was that he was from Missouri. He says his parents never talked to him about being a conscience objector. He says his minister didn't talk to him about being a conscience objector. He got his knowledge of how to defend his position by reading the Gospel Herald. And I thought that was interesting, because I think in this community, Dan Fisher and Sanford Yoder were active in talking to young men about these issues, and they were also very active in visiting people in the camps. There's a story in this book of a man named Jesse Schwarzenhuber. His parents lived in Iowa for 10 years and then Nebraska for 10 years. He was born in Nebraska. Subsequently, they moved to Alberta. He came back and worked in this community in some places, and I'm not sure where he was, but he ended up getting drafted. And he ended up being sent to Camp Dodge. And the story he tells is that Sanford Yoder came to Camp Dodge. One of the proposals for these men to do something other than military service was for them to get a farm assignment. And so Sanford arranged for 10 young men from Camp Dodge to come here in this community and work on farms. And he went to Camp Dodge and brought him on the train here. Jesse says he was assigned to work for Joe Yoder, and I'm not sure who that Joe Yoder is, but 38 cars brought 200 people that showed up at Joe Yoder's farm to protest his hiring this young man. And the outcome of it was that all the 10 people that came here for farm work got sent back to Camp Dodge. So that was not a popular thing in this community. Jesse was later sent to another farmer somewhere else in Iowa and worked there until the end of the war. When Jesse Hartzler was asked, how do you feel about this experience of your being drafted and what happened to you? He thought it was a good thing. He was glad that that was part of his life experience that shaped him. I've asked Holly Blosser Yoder to talk about what happened in the Wayland community with people's experiences there, and then to talk some about how these times and these experiences shaped churches and people's lives in the community.
Good evening. So what happened in the Wayland area? I'll talk about a CO from Sugar Creek, C.L. Graber, Christian L. Graber, and a church leader from Sugar Creek, Simon Gingrich, and how their experiences of the war impacted them. And then with these personal stories as background, I'll make some comments about how the experiences of COs, their pastors, their communities affected their churches and community life, and for Amish and Mennonite folks for decades going forward. In my book chapter about World War I don't distinguish between Amish Mennonite and Mennonite congregations. It's a book about those people that were going to be Iowa-Nebraska Conference. And so they were on their way to becoming one, but they weren't all one at the time that this happened. But that happened in 1921, for those of you who don't have that in mind. When I talk about Amish Mennonite, that's the change-minded branch of the Amish church. The folks that decided we're not going to try to maintain the ways of the older, generation. We're going to make modest, incremental changes, intentional changes. And that is the people that many of us come from, the change-minded Amish. And they merged with the Mennonites in 1921 in this area. That's some background. The other thing I want to mention before I get going with the stories is that a lot of what shaped my understanding of World War I came from an author named Gerlach Hohmann. And he wrote a book called, I think it's called The Greatest War, and it's about conscientious objectors. And I actually met Gerlach when I was researching the conference history. I met him in Goshen at the archives, and I told him just, how his book impressed me so much and really formed my ideas about World War I. He said, oh, I wrote that a long time ago, I forgot all about that. And that's kind of how I felt when I was asked to speak tonight. It's been, more than 25 years or more since I did that research and wrote about it. So I was kind of relearning it, and it was wonderful to hear about Happy Henry, who I don't recall researching very much myself, and really cool to hear that story. Some other key context about World War I objectors, and this echoes some things that you've heard. There were no official provisions in the law that the Selective Service that was passed by Congress about selective service. They might have said, okay, you can be a CO, but they didn't make provisions for that. There was nothing for them to do other than what camp commanders told them to do. The Secretary of War naively believed that COs would be convinced to join in, that they would just be, excited about the noble aims of the war to end all wars, and they would join in. And so his philosophy was, to use the carrot rather than the stick. But as you've heard in these stories many times, the experience of the COs was the stick and very little carrot in terms of how they were treated by this military system that really didn't have a way to understand or respect their position. A key characteristic of these World War I conscientious objectors that came from our communities is that they were from farming communities. They were used to manual labor. They were naturally inclined to work. So juxtapose that with being in a situation where their faith told them that they could not work. So that was hard for them. It's hard for them to say no when they were asked to, sweep the floor or do other work. But it was a slippery slope, and anything they did conveyed to superiors that they could perhaps be convinced or manipulated to do more. So C.L. Graber of Wayland, In his observation, in his memoirs, he said that COs were the targets of authorized or at least permitted brutality at Camp Pike in Arkansas, where he was. He had a scar on his shoulder that was evidence of that. They were all, talked down to about how they should join the noble aims of the war. He said no one changed his mind about that. Later, he was transferred to Fort Riley in Kansas, and there the commander came up with something that the COs could do. They were assigned to clear brush and weeds from nearby government land. So something a little more removed than taking care of forces that a military might conceivably use in warfare. Later, after his discharge as a Heston College student, C.L. Graber volunteered for medical and refugee work in Lebanon. He wanted to do something positive. He wanted to contribute. Beginning in 1925, he served on the Mennonite Church's Peace Problems Committee. There were a lot of problems committees back in that day, and this was the Peace Problems Committee. In World War II, he represented the Mennonites on the historic Peace Church's delegation to President Roosevelt to secure provisions for COs. No one wanted a repeat of World War I. He became an administrator of the CPS program in World War II, and he served as the first national director of Mennonite Disaster Service. And he was an organizer of PAX service programs in Europe in 1950. So that is the journey of a CO of World War I. And C.L. Graber was born in 1895. I kind of like to have a sense of the ages of these people. So he wasn't the youngest of the conscientious objectors in 1917. Simon Gingrich, born in 1882, he just would have been in his mid-30s, was a new bishop. And as a church leader, he was subject to severe intimidation as a harbinger or a foreshadowing of the kind of intimidation that he would experience. In the 1917 conference meeting of the Western District Amish Mennonite Conference, which was held in Manson that year, the postmaster delivered a dire warning and a threat. And I'll read that from my book. I just love to hear the cadence and the phrasing of how people talked 100 years ago. And what this postmaster, who apparently was the most official thing around, said was, I have been informed by good authority that at one of your meetings during your conference this week, the question of whether or not the United States was justified in entering the present war will come up for discussion. Whether or not this is true, I cannot say, but I am taking this means of informing you that any criticism of the government's course in this war is expressly forbidden by the Espionage Act, as passed by Congress. I therefore request you, on behalf of the Department of Justice, if this question of the right or wrong of war was intended for discussion, not to allow this to come up at your conference, as I will be compelled to report the facts of the matter to the proper authorities, should there be any criticism of the course the government has taken. So then they responded to that, and he responded more peaceably after that. But a pretty threatening message to your Mennonite conference meeting in Manson. So that came pretty early in the war. And then as an individual leader, Simon Gingrich was repeatedly called for questioning by the Henry County Council of Defense, and also confronted by other less than official promoters of the war, such as the new medical doctor in Wayland, who instigated confrontations with Gingrich and with other Mennonite ministers. Sometimes this doctor was able to draw a crowd, and in one case, as reported by Sanford C. Yoder in his writings, the mob was gathered until after midnight. As a coping mechanism, this 36-year-old bishop began to reduce and hide his work, advocating for conscientious objectors. So he tried to do it in secret. But the intimidation had an impact. At one point, he was intimidated into signing a statement agreeing to COs wearing military uniforms. And there's a picture of C.L. Graber in a military uniform in my book. And I wonder if it was connected to that decision by his pastor to agree to COs wearing military uniforms. And that was published in the state's leading newspapers at the time. So this was big news. It was well known all around the state. Gingrich almost immediately reverted to his original position, the official position of the Mennonite Church, which was that they shouldn't wear uniforms. But the publication weakened the position of the COs in camp, as you can imagine. Like ministers everywhere, Gingrich was pressured to contribute to the war effort and to set an example. He eventually pledged $5,000. I don't know what that would be today, but it sounds like a lot of money to me, on behalf of his church for purchase of war bonds. So those of you who may remember or have heard tell of Simon Gingrich, his reputation is as a kind of a hard liner. He was actually recruited to hold the line in Sugar Creek, which was kind of, maybe hard to handle down there in Wayland. And yet here we see him as a young bishop being intimidated, being pushed around, allowing himself to be manipulated. So I open my chapter in the book with a report of Sanford C. Yoder, this one born in 1879, so he also is a fairly young bishop, not yet 40 years old at this time, preaching at Sugar Creek, which we might infer was at the invitation of his cousin, Simon Gingrich. And I'd like to read that report from the Gospel Herald as well. Think about just how important that Gospel Herald was in those days. The reporter wrote, Brother Yoder preached a very impressive sermon, comparing the present time with the times of the children of Israel, how they prospered, living in such a rich country, and everything went well. Then they were led into captivity. So it is in this day and age of the world. We are living in a prosperous country, raising good crops, with all the luxurious automobiles without end, and all at once we are in the midst of the greatest war. So I think we can gather from that a feeling or an experience that Mennonites would have shared with their non-Mennonite neighbors, their non-CO neighbors, conscientious objector neighbors, which was that things were going well. There was prosperity. We were changing from, old ways to new progressive ways, from horses to cars, and all of a sudden there is this war that interrupts and threatens their lives, threatens their prosperity, threatens their peace. They shared that with their neighbors. What their experience was different from their neighbors was that they began to be looked upon with suspicion and distrust. And here, I like Frank said, I don't think there's anything we have to really compare that to. The fanatical nationalism that arose during World War I is something we don't really have anything quite like. But if you can remember what it felt like after 9/11, I work at the university now, and I can pretty much count on my fellow workers to support my faith-based positions, and even to agree with many of them. It's a liberal town, and they're open-minded, and they appreciate a peace perspective. But I know if I had worked at the university at that time, that I wouldn't have been able to count on that same feeling of support or unity or understanding. It was a time where you just felt like you felt your difference from the community at large. And we lost members at our church over that we didn't respond the way people expected their church community to respond. And certainly the Mennonite churches at that time lost young men who did not choose to be COs. That must have been painful, or at least awkward. We talked about how the leaders were called upon to preach and teach, and I think that did happen in this community a lot. Sanford C. Yoder did that. People read their gospel heralds. There's another report that I have written in my book that comes from South English, where they talk about a preacher coming and reinforcing their CO position. And again, that causing some distrust and some alienation within the community, but that it built up their own faith. So communities counted on their ministers, and they counted on their church periodical to reinforce their beliefs, and they counted on their church leaders to advocate for their COs with officials and with government leaders. So that has an impact. That has an impact on the community. It has an impact on those leaders. Among the ways that communities experienced the war, there were trials and tribulations that we've heard about. Young men were belittled and brutalized in these camps. Churches were vandalized. Pastors were called before government bodies and questioned. People were pressured to buy war bonds. The conference was threatened. There were threats of mob justice in and around some towns. Tar and feathering was threatened. So there were those trials and tribulations, but there was also growth and strength that came out of that experience. In camps where COs were marginalized and dehumanized, those experiences gave them a new appreciation for passages in the Bible like, "Fear not him that is able to kill you and destroy the body, but fear him who is able to destroy the soul and cast you into hell," from the Gospel of Matthew. They understood that in a new and more immediate way. So this suffering and the faithful responses of COs had effects on their Mennonite communities. It provided generations of Mennonites with models of faithfulness in the face of persecution. Those stories that were gathered had been told orally in the community and shared before they were written down in the book. They had an impact. They were models. They were like a present-day version of the Martyr's Mirror. The fact that it forced ministers into advocacy roles and to be able to articulate their position to people who were not believers surely must have developed leadership skills that they didn't have before. It raised up leaders like Sanford C. Yoder and Chris L. Graber, who went on to serve in responsible roles in the broader church. For those who remained in their Mennonite churches, the experience of the war bound them more closely together. It sharpened their awareness of their differences, even from their Christian neighbors. It caused them to look inward. It could be argued that the feeling of threat had a role in reinforcing separatist leanings that already existed in our tradition and that held sway until the 50s and 60s. It may have also reinforced practices of nonconformity, those made visible in dress and exercised in disapproval of marriage outside of the Mennonite church. It might have reinforced deference to bishop authority to keep communities close and hold the line against loss of a shared faith. Looking outward, responses to the war required a new level of leadership from their ministers, as they had to meet with officials and travel to camps to visit and advocate for COs, and ultimately to argue for a way for Mennonites to serve their country in ways that do not support violence. It could be argued that it strengthened Mennonite understandings of themselves as active peacemakers. Responses to post-war suffering abroad spurred mission and relief efforts overseas and a broader worldview. Growing out of the World War I experience, we got creative, took initiative, and took an active role in building up our society through alternative service and our world through international relief. As exemplified by Graeber and Yoder, World War I sent local leaders from our community into broader church service, reinforcing connections between us and the broader Mennonite world, and even with Christians around the world. Both C.L. Graeber and Sanford C. Yoder, CO and Bishop, during the war were later involved in Mennonite higher education and other Mennonite institution building, as well as Mennonite mission efforts abroad, formed by that experience during World War I. So I think we can see that World War I profoundly shaped the Mennonite church and its communities in the decades that followed.
Thank you, Holly. We'll pass the basket here for our offering at this point. I'll give you an opportunity for anybody you have questions or stories you want to tell. Questions for our speakers?
We're passing the basket so that I asked whether there was expense involved with the Voices of Conscience exhibit, and I haven't gotten an answer yet, but any money that's involved in that, if there's any left over, it'll go to the Mennonite Historical Society.
Holly, did Simon Gingrey, when people in your time would talk about his legacy, did they fault him for his giving in to buying some war bonds? Or?
I don't think so. I think he just had such a reputation as a strong leader.
She says he had a reputation as a strong leader and it didn't really have a negative connotation years later. Yeah, it is. This whole thing is quite a remarkable story of how people found themselves in situations that they didn't know what to do. And they did what they thought best, I think. Going forward, it's a little hard to know what's going to happen if there's another big war. Right now, there's no draft, so we're not called to serve. And if there is a draft again, will they allow conscience objection? Will they allow alternative service programs like we've had? The CPS, 1W, PAC service, all those things grew out of people's concern for what had happened to their young people in World War I. And so there was a very active effort to change. And it was a successful effort. So as I look out across the crowd, I see people who went places and did things that they wouldn't have otherwise done, probably. So it's been an influence. Well, thank you very much for coming, and let me just close with a word of prayer. Lord, you've given us much. We are very blessed, and we are blessed with many freedoms now. There's been struggles in the past, and we don't know what the future holds, but we just trust your Spirit to guide us. We just pray for the wars that are active to somehow stop, and that we can be peacemakers in our place we find ourselves, wherever we go. Amen. You are dismissed.
I want people to know that the museum area over here does have an exhibit.
The display is open.
Yeah.
Please take advantage of it. And there are significant stories told there as well. So, thank you.
This